I want to say this is a complex topic and it's very easy to get lost. During the week I was talking to someone, actually the person who suggested the topic, and they suggested that I bring in other authors than Swedenborg to talk about this. And I've actually resisted doing so, simply because what Swedenborg says is complex enough. To bring in other authors saying other things about it using different terminology, it just becomes a bit overwhelming. So I've restricted myself only to what Swedenborg writes. And look, there are many worthy authors who've spoken about our inner and outer natures, so I don't want to exclude them. I just want to make today a bit simpler than it might have been otherwise. So I really want to focus on what is both simple and useful about this topic for us today. So we might think of ourselves, when we think of our inner and outer natures, as a soul, a mind and a body. We think of the soul as that which is unseen, hidden within us. We think of a body as that which is seen by others around us, okay, out in the physical world. And we might think of the mind as kind of a bridge between the two, or it's part of us which is half seen and half unseen. However, what I want to just point out about what Swedenborg writes is he's actually not concerned with all of this picture. He is really predominantly writing about the mind. Here's what he writes. This is New Jerusalem and Its Heavenly Doctrine. The inner and outer parts I am talking about are the inner and outer parts of our spirit. The body is just an extra outer part added on, in which the other two exist. The body does not do anything by itself. Everything it does comes from the spirit inside. So we have that phrase that he uses, an extra outer part added on. So let's go back to our soul, mind and body. So he talks about the body as kind of like an interface with the physical world, and he is not at all interested in it. So if you look at what Swedenborg writes about internal and external, forget the body. The soul, it's worth saying, as the recipient of life, he occasionally comments upon, but it is so deeply hidden within us that really there is not much we can do about our soul. And the reason for that is it needs protection. If we were to be able to fiddle with our soul, we would be done for. Okay, let's zoom in on the mind. In Heavenly Secrets, paragraph 8443, he talks about 6 levels of truth. 6 levels. The first level is the divine level of truth. That is completely inaccessible to us. It's inaccessible to the angels, but it's there, just realize. He then talks about what proceeds directly from the divine. And he says that's also inaccessible. We cannot access it, the angels cannot access it. He then goes on to the celestial level, which is the highest heaven. And he says this is accessible by the celestial angels, but not by us. Then there is the spiritual or the middle heaven, which is accessible by the spiritual angels, but again, not by us. And then he moves on to the natural or lowest heaven, and he says this may, to some small extent, be perceived by man, but only if he is enlightened, though even then it is such that human language is incapable of expressing a large part of it. So we get the merest glimpse of this natural lowest level of divine truth. And then he says there's this ultimate level. He says the 6th level of God's truth is as it exists with man. It is adjusted to his discernment, thus it is the sense of the letter of the word. Okay? This is where we are, the ultimate, the lowest level of divine truth. So we've got all of these 6 levels, and then he also does things like he uses terms like an interior natural and an exterior natural. We're going to look at those in a minute. He uses terms like the internal memory and the external memory. So you can just appreciate how complex the picture is. What I want us to do is think about the terms internal and external more as being comparative to one another. So he's saying here are 2 things. One is more internal, one is more external. That's the easiest way for us to grasp these terms. He's not trying to define a level, which is the internal, and a level, which is the external. So he's not trying to be definitive, he's comparing 2 things. That's the easiest way to imagine or talk about this. So what can we understand and what can we use? What is valuable to us in our life? And I want to go to the story that we read about the baker and the butler, thrown into prison by Pharaoh. Because as Swedenborg talks about this story, he talks about this being a picture of the mind. Here's where he uses these terms, the interior natural and the exterior natural. So Pharaoh represents this interior natural. He says Pharaoh is the ruler. That's fairly obvious. So what rules us? It's the decision maker. It's kind of like the executive function of the mind. It's the thing that weighs things up and comes to a conclusion and then acts on it. This is what Pharaoh represents. I wonder myself whether this is like our observing self. Okay, our ability to look both into our own minds and our external world and come to a conclusion and formulate a series of actions or steps we're going to take. That's Pharaoh. And then you have the butler. Now the butler and the baker, bear in mind, are servants. And because they're servants, he talks about them as being exterior or more external. And their job is to serve what is internal. This is one of the principles Swedenborg always lays out. There's the exterior serving the interior. So the servant in the story represents that lower serving level. So he says the butler serves the understanding. Just bear in mind what the butler is doing. The butler is concerned with the cup of Pharaoh and what Pharaoh drinks. Truth. So he serves the understanding, but the thing that the butler does is because it serves the understanding, it thinks from learned principles. Things we have taken in, rational things. It deals in terms of truth. And so because it's dealing with those sort of internal things, the rational things, it's influenced from what is higher. Okay? It's influenced from what is higher, and that's quite important. The baker, bread, goodness, love, desire. The baker serves the will. And the will has a tendency to draw its conclusions from the senses, from external things. So the baker looks at lower principles and sees those as being important to make decisions and understand reality. So you have this butler and the baker who look in opposite directions. One looks up and one looks down. And these 2 men have their dreams, and they come then to Joseph. Now Joseph brings divine insight, which reveals the proper order of the mind. And the proper order of the mind is that what is lower, what is external, should serve what is higher, what is internal. And this is what Joseph's interpretation of these dreams is all about. It reveals this fact to us. And so eventually what happens, but bear in mind, not at the end of this story, eventually what happens is that principle, the Joseph principle, which is the Lord actually, There's many, many tie-ins with the life of Joseph and the life of the Lord. That principle eventually has to rule. So, how does all of this apply to me? Well, you know, in every situation we are in, every circumstance we meet, we can come to a conclusion or develop an action plan or a way forward based on one of two things. We can base it on internal principles, on rational ideas, on ideas that we've learnt about what is good and what is true. And that's the true way forward. But we have this other way of looking at the world too, which looks at external things. You know, the world of the senses, the world of the emotions often as well, as we respond to things that are happening to us, be they good or be they bad. And this little story is just pointing out the fact that if we live our lives according to rational principles, according to principles of goodness and truth, then that will lead us on and we will develop and find a positive and a useful way forward. That's the butler. Whereas if we are to follow our emotions, if we are to follow the way things look to us on an external level, that's the baker. And it's always going to lead us in the wrong direction. This is the story. So that baker way of looking at things needs to go. It needs to go because it will always lead us in the wrong direction. Now, it might be very easy to think, oh, this is not my problem. You know, I'm good, that's everybody else. But, you know, I know what I'm doing. But you only have to spend a little bit of time reflecting on your own life and your own interactions and reactions in circumstances in the past, even the way you might tend to act with, you know, in the present, with certain things that, you know, really rile you and get you angry. Those, we can see how easy it is to be drawn down that path of the external world, following the feelings and desires that we have within us. It's so easy to do, and we're all subject to it. So I guess your task for the week is just spend some time in reflection and just notice these processes that take place. Are you going to follow the external, the desires that press upon you and push you in a certain direction, or are you going to stop and think and just reflect on the principles of goodness and truth that you've learnt, that you know will carry you forward in a positive direction? I've mentioned before a book that I have on my shelves, and I always remember towards the end of the book, it's talking about organisations and getting an organisation out of a place where it's kind of stuck and doesn't really know how to move forward, and moving it forward in a positive way. And the advice it gives at the end of the book is, the thing that you don't want to do is probably the thing that you need to do. And I read that and it brought me up short, because I thought, there are things that I actively resist doing that I know are probably good for me. The thing that you don't want to do is the thing you probably should do. Yeah, we know also stories like the poem, Take the Road Less Travelled. And Jesus himself said, enter through the narrow gate. You know, we know it. We've just got to remember to do it from time to time.